Hello and welcome to the International News Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Denis Donicic. Now, like, comment, and subscribe. Engage in our growing international community. Now, let's get into our main report today, which is going to be an update on the ever-growing and ever-tense Russo-Ukrainian crisis. Now, we're just going to cover some things this week that could become important developments and that are demonstrating in what direction this entire crisis is going. Now, the two main things we're going to discuss are Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz. Macron is the leader of France and Olaf Scholz is the Chancellor of Germany. Both of them are making crucial and pivotal diplomatic meetings with foreign leaders. Specifically, Olaf Scholz is meeting with U.S. President Joe Biden, and this will be his first meeting ever since becoming Chancellor 2 months ago to the United States. Now, Macron will be meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. And these meetings are actually a good sign that are showing that diplomatic dialogue is continuing to happen. And the language that has been used by all parties completely supports the fact that every party seems to fundamentally be interested in finding a diplomatic and political conclusion to this crisis as opposed to this resulting or attempting to be resolved by war. Now, we have covered what is going on extensively, and if you want to catch up on all of the updates and everything that's been happening, please take a look at our Europe playlist. You will find all the videos in there. But just to give a very quick refresher, basically, at its most basic level, what is going on is that Russia has amassed around 100,000 soldiers north and east of Ukraine's border. Many of these soldiers have been in Ukraine's neighbor and ally, Belarus. Now, this has obviously raised concerns in Ukraine, the United States, and several NATO allies and European countries that Russia is potentially planning an invasion or an attack on Ukraine. Now, Russia has stated publicly that it has no intention and does not want to invade Ukraine. It has no intention of invading, and it does not want to start a war. That has been Russia's public stance. However, that comes with a caveat. The Russians have had two major demands of the United States and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Demand number one has been that that Ukraine be permanently banned and barred from joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Demand number two has been that all of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization member states and allies remove all military assets, including soldiers, weapons, missiles, and other defense systems in Eastern European countries, former Soviet bloc countries, or allies, and from Russia's geopolitical sphere of influence. Now, NATO and the United States have both said, that ain't gonna happen, Putin. We're not gonna permanently block Ukraine, and for that matter, any country from ever joining NATO. NATO is an organization that has its doors constantly open and allows any nation to join. Russia could theoretically join if it wanted to. Number two is that NATO is not going to remove its military assets from Eastern Europe because it would be decreasing its own geopolitical sphere of interest. Now, Russia is not the bad guy here, and neither is the West. Both sides are simply looking out for what is known as a geopolitical sphere of influence. Russia is obviously looking out for its regional sphere of influence, which is neighboring it, right? So Ukraine and Eastern Europe, which is a buffer zone from NATO and from the West for Russia. Now, the United States obviously is looking out for its own geopolitical sphere of interest in Europe, and Europe doesn't want Russia's sphere of interest to expand and get closer to other European countries. Every single actor that is involved in this crisis is simply looking out for their own interests, and their demands and their goals are completely legitimate. Russia's are, America's are, Europe's are, and now the main purpose of everything that's going on is to find a common sense, logical, diplomatic solution to avoid a war, which would be extremely costly in human life, especially if we are following what has been going on in Ukraine, where civilians, normal citizens, have been learning how to utilize weapons and fighting guerrilla tactics. This war could be costly if it resulted in an insurgency. A lot of lives could be lost. The economic cost of the war would be massive. American sanctions against Russia and European sanctions against Russia would collapse not just Russia's economy, but majorly hurt the West as well. Now, in addition to that, it would just ruin the relations between Russia and the Western world, which is not something that anyone wants to do. The reality is that political cooperation and diplomacy are much more common and much more respected and sought after in today's modern world. Now, what has been happening have been a series of diplomatic talks up until this point, all of which have failed to produce anything constructive. However, on a good note, they have continued dialogues, and it seems that some specific points of interest are coming across, and that the public diplomatic language that is being used, again, we do not know what's happening privately, no one does, but the public diplomatic language that is being used seems to indicate that both sides are willing to make some relative concessions to find a solution. Now, Macron visiting Putin, and Putin praising his visit and stating that France, these are the words of Putin. So Macron is scheduled to have a meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin tomorrow, on Tuesday. Vladimir Putin, ahead of this meeting, has praised France for being one of the major countries that have upheld peace in Europe. And France fundamentally has been one of the peacekeepers in Europe. In addition to this, the meeting between Macron and Putin, coincidentally, it was not done on purpose, but coincidentally comes at the 30-year anniversary of when France and Russia signed a friendship and cooperation treaty. Now, the meeting that Olaf Scholz, the newly minted German chancellor who is taking over for Angela Merkel, Olaf Scholz will be visiting the United States. This is Scholz's first major diplomatic visit to the United States ever since becoming chancellor, and will be a defining moment in the beginning of his political career. Now, the meeting between Macron and Putin is actually going to be much easier and much more pleasant. Macron and Putin do have a tense relationship, but it does show, and they have historically cooperated with one another. Now, Olaf Scholz and the Biden administration fundamentally don't know each other. Olaf Scholz is new. He's not Angela Merkel. He's not the German chancellor we've all gotten used to. He's someone else. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Merkel eventually had to retire. That's just a fact. I hope she's enjoying her retirement. But Scholz is a new kind of figure in German politics that foreign countries like America, Russia, France, any other world leader is not used to dealing with. Now, Scholz and his government have already been extensively criticized for what has been perceived, and I'll be honest with you, what has been a completely lackluster German approach and response to the tensions going on in Ukraine. Now, most European allies and the United States have either sent military resources, soldiers, provided financial aid, and stated that they will introduce sanctions against Russia in response to the Russian buildup of troops. They have had a strong and firm and united response to Russia's demands. Germany, not so much. Now, Germany does this because Germany is dependent upon Russian natural gas and other energy imports. Fundamentally, it is. Now, you have to understand that all of Europe is dependent on Russian natural gas imports. 1/3 of all natural gas, which heats Europe, which provides energy for Europe, comes from Russia. And even if Europe was able to substitute these imports with American liquefied natural gas, which can be shipped with boats, it still would not be nearly enough to meet the European demand. In addition to this, it would completely increase the cost of energy in the United States, and it would be economically bad for everyone. So Germany is looking out for its own economic interests, more specifically the economic interests of its people. Energy costs have already skyrocketed in Europe, in some countries going up by not one, not two, but 8 times more expensive than they were previously. And I lived in Europe. Energy was already fucking expensive back then. I can only imagine what it's like now. Now, the reality is Germany has this interest, but they have been completely weak in their response to Russia's amassing of troops. While other countries have been sending weapons, financial aid, and soldiers into neighboring countries of Ukraine, Germany has sent helmets, which was criticized. The mayor of Kiev, the capital city of Ukraine, after the German government decided to send, I think it was 5,000 helmets to Ukraine, stated, "What is next? Pillows?" And that's true. What the fuck are you doing sending helmets? And if you're going to send helmets, send pillows. So at least their heads can be comfy too. Now, Germany has in recent days and weeks began to take a stronger approach to Russia. Germany has stated that if Russia were to invade Ukraine, that they would shut off operations of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is a pipeline that will be open soon to deliver natural gas, the crucial resource that I just mentioned, directly from Russia into Germany. Now, in addition to that, Germany will begin sending soldiers into Eastern European countries to just show their solidarity with their NATO allies. Now, Olaf Scholz's meeting with US President Joe Biden is to clarify where Germany stands on this issue. And it can be expected that Olaf Scholz will take a much firmer stance against Russian tension building in Ukraine. Now, the reality is both of these meetings, Macron and Putin, and Scholz and Biden, nothing can be really expected from them. It needs to be understood that what is going on between Russia and Ukraine, and really NATO and Russia, is extremely complex, dynamic, and has a lot of actors involved. No agreement is going to be made between just two parties alone. The reality is nothing constructive is going to come from these meetings, but something can begin, and it can be the beginning of very good peace talks. Now, in addition to this, there have been talks of creating what is called a Normandy format meeting. Now, a Normandy format meeting would be a meeting between the heads of state of Russia, Ukraine, France, Germany, and eventually the United States to personally meet the heads of state. So we're talking US President Joe Biden, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, French President Emmanuel Macron, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and Russian President Vladimir Putin. In addition to this, eventually British Prime Minister can also join Boris Johnson to discuss an actual full solution to what is going on in Ukraine. Now, it should be noted that the chiefs of staff and high-ranking staff of the offices of the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, France, and Germany recently met on January 26th in Paris. But nothing constructive came from this meeting, and the only thing that happened was they agreed to meet within 2 weeks. Now, Volodymyr Zelensky, Emmanuel Macron, and other leaders have stated that it would be productive if the leaders, the actual heads of state of each country, could meet and discuss a potential solution to what is going on. Now, every party is open to this except Russia. Russia does not want to meet with Volodymyr Zelensky. They have stated that they will not meet with Zelensky until, they will not meet with any Ukrainian president until Ukraine begins to create a warmer relation with Russia. Now, Russia has actually stated that it would be willing to meet with Volodymyr Zelensky if Zelensky's government would respect the agreements from the 2015 Minsk Agreement. Now, the 2015 Minsk Agreement was a diplomatic treaty between Russia, France, Germany, and Ukraine to resolve the conflict going on in the eastern Donbass region, where pro-Russian separatists have been fighting the Ukrainian government for independence. Now, in the Minsk Treaty, Ukraine agreed to allow autonomy for the separatist region in Donbass, while also allowing all of the separatists themselves to receive full amnesty and not be potentially persecuted or prosecuted by a court of justice. Now, Ukraine promised that it would do this with the understanding that Russia would eventually allow Ukraine to reconsolidate its border in eastern Donbass. Donbass would again be part of Ukraine without a Russian invasion or Russian occupation, but Donbass would be an autonomous region. Ukraine agreed to this, but they have not done anything, and they have stated that they are not going to do anything because they felt that they were pressured by the West to just sign any peace agreement to make sure that any form of war in Ukraine was avoided. And that could actually be true. Now, there have been general diplomatic pushes to create another form of Minsk meeting or Minsk agreement. It doesn't have to necessarily be in Belarus, Minsk. It can be anywhere. It can be in Paris, it can be in Moscow, it can be in Kyiv, it can be fucking anywhere. It doesn't matter. What's important is creating a peace treaty. Now, what is important to understand is that Ukraine is a little bit concerned about going into any kind of peace treaty itself because it does not want to face another 2015 Minsk incident where it makes a lot of consolidations and promises to Russia because of Western pressure. But what is important, and the main takeaway from the story today that I want you guys to have, is that everyone is working hard to ensure peace. Does that mean that peace is guaranteed? No, nothing guarantees anything in politics. But the reality is that every single actor that is invested in this wants some form of peace. And that while you may see in the news things that look crazy and that look like, oh my God, they're about to go to war, this is just brinkmanship. Every side is just trying to build tensions to make an agreement more likely to happen. War is unlikely, at least in my opinion. But if you disagree with me, let me know in the comments. Let's have a nice, productive conversation. Let me know what you think about the 2015 Minsk Agreement, what you think about Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, what you think about Vladimir Putin, and how you think this general situation is going to pan out. Thanks for tuning in. Like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you tomorrow.